welcome to our series about the Forest School principles. In today's video, we're going to have a conversation about why Forest School is learner-centred. I'm Lou, I'm one of the Forest School Association's directors, and with me in conversation is Lily.
Hello, I'm Lily, I'm chair of the FSA and a Forest School trainer and practitioner.
So the Forest School Association is the UK charity for Forest School that aims to promote and celebrate quality forest school for all. We were set up in 2012 as a grassroots organisation after the UK Forest School community wanted an umbrella organisation to unite under and to help represent them. The Forest School itself is a type of outdoor learning that happens over a long period of time in an outdoor woodland environment and aims to build confidence, self-esteem and emotional resilience in the learners. There are 6 key principles of the Forest School ethos that underpin the philosophy and the way of working. These principles were created in 2010 by the UK Forest School community. Then a couple of years later, when the Forest School Association was created, part of its remit is to promote and celebrate these principles. In this series of videos, we're aiming to take each of the 6 principles and unpick it in a bit more depth through conversation. So we'll be looking at what does the principle mean, why it's important to Forest School, and then how do we put those principles into practice. I'd like to start by looking at the definition itself of this principle. So I'm going to just read it out. Forest School uses a range of learner-centred processes to create a community for being, development and learning. So Lily, do you think you could unpick that a little bit for us and explain what that means to you?
It's interesting stuff, isn't it? Because it talks about learner-centred. I mean, that's the first bit in there. And that for me is around focusing on the needs and interests of the individuals who are part of a Forest School programme. And when we look at it a little bit more, we think about how learner-centred might be different from learner-directed or learner-driven, and how those kind of look in reality as well. The bit I really like is this idea of creating a community of learning, though, because that for me feels like the real core of what Forest School is about, is building that community of learning in a natural environment. That really speaks to me there.
So you talk about learner-centred possibly being different from learner-directed and some of the other terms. So do you think you could speak more to the differences between those descriptors?
Yeah, I find it quite interesting that the principles talk about Forest School being learner-centred rather than learner-directed, learner-led, because it also talks about play and choice being a really key part of that approach, really valuable to that. Learner-centred, for me, is thinking about what are the needs, what are the interests, what are the things that will help this person grow and develop. Learner-directed might be just the things that they're interested in. So for me, there's less external input if something's completely learner-led, learner-directed, rather than being learner-centred. So when it's learner-centred, you're guided by the needs and interests of that person, but that's not the only driver. You know, there's an external influence, more of an external influence, which I think is where the Forest School practitioner has their role.
And what about this formation of a community? Can you speak more to what that might look like?
Yeah, so some interesting conversations recently about how Forest School and the planning for Forest School is around not just the individual, but also the group. So holding those two things together being really important. And so a lot of the process of Forest School, and Forest School is being about in that process rather than it being a product. And part of that process is about creating a community of learners. And that takes time, you know, that takes relationship building. It takes the practitioners and the other members of that learning community to reflect and observe what's going on for each other and to grow, and all of those things that kind of are around the sort of human development and the outcomes that come out of that part of the process.
So you mentioned about Forest School being different to curriculum-led outdoor approaches. So do you think you could speak a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, there's something that I read recently about curriculum-based approaches, and I'll read it out because I like the quote. It's giving children the answers to questions that they have never asked. And for me, that's one of the things that really shines out about Forest School, is that actually for the participants, but also for that community of learning that we were talking about, you're all in there trying to find out answers to questions that you didn't even know you had, but that have come up and are really live in that moment and are really brought to you by the place that you're in and the people that you're with. And so all of that, how that then moves children towards the outcomes, the personal, social, emotional development outcomes that Forest School is so great at delivering, I think is really key. Mm. One of the things that I find quite interesting is the fact that in the UK, certainly we're quite driven by the curriculum. And so when people talk about how do they make sure there's space in the curriculum for Forest School, but they're not able to deliver that curriculum through Forest School, you know, what does Forest School offer to that? And this idea that if we've got attitudes and skills for learning, which I think is one of the things that children really start to develop when they're out in the woods, you know, that self-motivation, the resilience, the self-awareness, all of those things really help their learning attributes, so that when they are looking at curriculum-based stuff, they're really supported in their own skills and attitudes to learning.
Mm. Mm. And so that child-led ethos helps those attitudes emerge in a holistic kind of way.
Yeah, and that is the key, isn't it? It's about that holistic approach. So it's not just about driving children towards the knowledge. It's actually what's going on for them, and really taking time to get to know them and build those relationships with the individuals, so that you can then help them understand themselves, and that you as an adult understand what their needs are, what their drivers are, what goes on for them. And I think one of the interesting things, and again when we look at play as being part of that learner-centered approach, is that actually children don't play in order to develop those outcomes and insights. That's not the thing that drives them. Like, oh, maybe if I play in the mud kitchen, I will develop better knowledge of materials. That's not how children's brains work. You know, it's actually the thing that internal drive that is taking them into their interests, is helping them sustain those interests over time as well.
Something about play that I've noticed when you're talking with other adults, teachers, parents even, is sometimes play can be considered a bit of a dirty word, you know, or they're just playing, you know, do you work first and then just play? So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about, you know, the essentialness and the value of play as an entity, and particularly play in nature, because we're talking about Forest School.
Yeah, I mean, play is just so key to human development. In fact, even, you know, in books that I've read about play, it's not just human development, animals as well develop their skills through play. And there's a really nice sort of way of looking at it that Bob Hughes, who's a play theorist, he talks about, that play puts children back in the biological driving seat of their own development, so that the things that they're interested in, the things that they need to develop next, will come out through their play. But also play is how children process things, it's how they learn, so that this idea of just playing is quite, I don't know, it's to devalue the experience of the children and their kind of, you know, to not recognize what it is that they want and need in that moment, you know, whereas their body, their brain is driving them towards something. Why is it that a child wants to go and poke at the same hole over and over and over? Because they haven't finished learning about that thing yet. So they keep going back to that same idea or that same object or that same texture to really explore that, or things that link to it as well. So, you know, again, it's trying to work out the world through their own experience, and that is so fundamental to how children learn and how they develop and how they grow. And it's really easy as adults to kind of have this idea that, you know, well, they're just playing. That's because in part of our mind thinks what they're doing is a bit boring. Like, oh, we could be doing something that's so much more stimulating and there's so much more learning in it. And actually in that moment, it's because we've learnt the thing that that child is doing. That's why it's boring to us, because we don't have that same need, that same drive to learn that thing. Because if you look at a baby trying to reach their toes, we know where our toes are. We've really sorted that as adults. You know, most people have sorted out where are their toes, but for a baby, they're still deep in that learning process. So it's quite easy for us as adults to think that children are just playing because we've moved beyond that stage of development.
I've read a lot of information about that children nowadays are getting less free play time and opportunities compared to previous generations, and there's suggestions that that's having an impact on both their mental and physical health. I wondered if you had anything to say around that, and you know, what happens if we don't allow children to play, and particularly play outside.
Yeah, there's a really interesting map. I'm sure you've seen it. A lot of people have, and it shows the play range of different children, children in different generations going back. And it's based in Sheffield, which is where I grew up, so I quite like it as well for that. And so it shows the range of the great grandfather, and he can travel 3-4 miles, something like that, across the city to go fishing. And then it shows the play range of the grandfather, who travels a mile away to go to the swimming pool, and then the mother who goes to the shops down the street, and then the child who is their play range is 1,000 feet or whatever it is, or 100 feet, you know, pretty much the end of their garden, and they're always watched. And what I think is really interesting about this mapping of children's play ranges is what experiences and interactions will they get in their free play as part of that range. So for the lad who was, you know, the great grandfather who was cycling down to the fishing pond, who would he have met on the way? What would he have seen? What would he have experienced? That really rich range of stimulus for learning and growth and all of that stuff that will have come in for him as an individual, compared with a child who's only not allowed out of their garden. So we have the impact now because of the way our society is, and there's loads of different factors that why society is like that now, and we can't change a lot of those factors, but we can recognise that the impact on children is that of play deprivation. And interestingly, it's not necessarily those children that have experienced deprivation in other ways who always experience play deprivation. You know, there's a lot of evidence to show that children who are overscheduled in terms of having French on a Monday and horse riding on a Tuesday and violin on Wednesday and all of this sort of thing actually have very little time for free play, so that their experience is one of play deprivation, although they don't have deprivation in other parts of their life. And the impact of play deprivation actually is that you don't get to choose and control what's going on in your life. And if you can choose and control what's going on in your life, that actually is one of the things that has an impact on your self-esteem and your ability to cope with what life throws at you, because you've learnt how to control yourself, you've learnt how to make choices. So you get that impact of positive self-esteem. And then that positive self-esteem gives you, you know, those positive experiences of the world, which actually means you're better able to make choices and control things. So it's this sort of virtuous circle that children get from being in control of their own experience. The flip side of that is that you then have children who are developing that sort of neuroticism, or, you know, those sort of things where children feel anxious and stressed and not able to control things and not able to make good decisions. So you kind of have the flip side of that as well, which, you know, is one of the things that I think is quite concerning for a lot of professionals now, is that we have consistently poor mental health compared to lots of other nations as well. And in the UK in particular, that's something that, you know, we're really looking at. And I think, and a lot of research shows that poor mental health is an impact of lack of free play.
Absolutely. I mean, I often consider Forest School as being sort of an in-between, because we live now in a culture where parents feel like they can't let their children go off and free play. Forest School is like an intermediate whatever that word is. Forest School is an in-between that means that there are adults present, but there's still that play and choice there for the children. And I consider it a bit of a sign of the times that something like Forest School is so necessary, you know, whereas before, previous generations would just have that in childhood. They wouldn't need Forest School because their childhood would be Forest School.
Yeah, so when free range childhood was just childhood, you know, that's the distinction, isn't it? And that actually what we're seeing is the impact of a skill gap almost in children's play. So when, you know, thinking about my parents describing their play experiences and even comparing them to my own experiences, that multi-aged play stuff that goes on. So when I was a child, all the kids from our street used to all just knock about together, you know, and so I'd be maybe 6 and my brother would be nearly 11, and then there'd be some slightly older kids. And so we'd all learn from each other, and they would learn to have empathy for and look after the little ones. And then as I got to be the bigger one, I would be the one, you know, setting the challenges and all those sort of things. And that multi-age play that was such a key part of a free range childhood transfers those skills, you know, like the ideas that pass around are transferred in that way. Whereas now when we've got children who don't have those experiences, there's a skill gap in play. And I've started to see the adults who are the generation who've experienced that as well. So, you know, the ones who are now 18, 19, 20 and maybe haven't had those play experiences, but are the next generation of professionals looking after children. And so that transfer of knowledge isn't happening because the adults haven't had those play experiences as well. So yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, how Forest School is, I think a lot of that need for Forest School comes from that bit of society that we're missing.
So I'm aware we've been talking a lot about play, but we haven't yet really unpicked what we mean by the word play. So would you like to unpick that a little bit more for us?
Oh yeah, it is. It's a really juicy thing to try and unpick what play is. The play theorist Stuart Brown, he says play, trying to define play is like analysing a joke. You know, it's kind of, as soon as you've picked it apart, you lose this sense of it. It's something we all know and feel, but actually when you try and define it, it becomes really interesting. And so often when I'm talking with groups of people about what play is, we talk about, you know, what is play? And you can chuck in so many different words. It's social, it's creative, it's exploring, it's, you know, there's lots of things that play is. But when we flip that around, so play doesn't have to be social. Play doesn't have to be about exploring. Play doesn't have to be creative. You know, so whatever play is huge and broad, but it doesn't have to be that to be play. So the things that we end up left with are about this learner-centered, the sort of the thing that where children have choice and control. They're the things that actually it's much harder to get rid of when you're looking at what play is. And again, that idea that play is the thing that puts the child back in the driving seat of their experience is really key in that. Children know what play is. You don't need to make children play, because they know it's intrinsic to them. It's that stuff that leaks out of them at every opportunity. There's a quote that I was just looking at here, that play is like oxygen. It's all around us. We don't notice it or appreciate it until it's missing. And again, that's Stuart Brown sort of trying to define play. It's that really key core thing to our experience. And so when we're looking at play in Forest School, for us as Forest School practitioners, we should be thinking about how do we then make space and time that children can process all of the stuff that's going on for them. When we were talking about play before, we were looking at how play benefits the children. So there's the fact that that's how they learn to be a human in the world. It's how they process their experience. So that might be role playing helps them understand the sociological stuff that's going on in their lives. Or it might be that play helps them process a trauma or a difficult experience that they have. There's certainly a lot of work being done with refugee children and looking at their play and their experiences, how those experiences come out through their play. Whatever goes into a child has to come out, and if it's going to come out, it's going to come out through their play.
And so we've been talking a lot specifically about children, you know, knowing what play is and the benefits to children from play, but what about adults?
Yeah, what about adults? Yeah, and that it is really interesting because, you know, one of the things I love is being with forest school practitioners because we get to play. But there's the flip side of that actually is, you know, these really playful adults are then let out in the world, and their play needs sometimes overtake the needs of the children, you know, because they're different, right? As adults, we have different play needs. So it is worth bearing in mind that all humans have play needs, and how we express those can support the children. You know, we can be modeling and then stepping away, or it can actually just end up like steamrolling the children's experience, and it becomes all about our play needs rather than theirs. And that's something I'm always really mindful of with my own, because I've got a lot of play needs, right? And they're always coming out all over the place. But actually what's mine, what's the children's is one of those really key reflective questions that I ask myself, like, whose play need was that? You know, that's a good reflective question.
So in this final section, I was hoping we could unpick a little bit about the application of the principle and how practitioners might go about applying the child-centred approach. So to start us off, I'm aware we live in a very modern, indoors, possibly sedentary lifestyle now. And so many children and young people might not spend a lot of time outdoors or in nature. So maybe the majority of their play comes from spending time indoors or perhaps through technology. So what advice or tips would you give about trying to encourage that sort of learner to engage with nature for their play?
That you describe is I think where the forest school practitioner and their own experience of play has real value, because, you know, we were talking about that skill gap between children's experiences in how they play, and that for some children being out in the woods is really so far out of their experience it's actually quite scary. And that's why forest schools are a long-term process as well, because it takes time to build that confidence about being in the environment. It takes time to build a relationship with the natural environment, and it takes time to notice what those affordances are. I mean, I'm thinking about a group of children that I worked with who are 2 and 3 years old, living in a very urban place and going through the streets to their nursery that was a concrete yard. And so when they came out to the woods with me, well, for the first thing, the bus driver said, "Oh, watch out for the crocodiles, kids." And they had no way of telling if there were going to be crocodiles in this woods or not because of their experience. So I actually had to spend the most of the first session making sure that they weren't afraid of being eaten by a crocodile. And we luckily found a big mossy log and climbed all over it and got to know it and all that sort of thing. And so it takes time for the children to build that relationship with the natural environment so that they can actually experience the affordances of that. And then that relationship, as that relationship grows, that's where you get care and stewardship and love of natural environments comes from playing in and being a part of that, being part of that natural world. So for us as practitioners, looking at ways that children can start to build that relationship is really interesting. You know, what are the open-ended springboards that we can offer children so that they can find their own thing, find their own needs and interests, but they've got a solid enough starting point. So for example, one of the things that I often do on the first session when I'm taking a new group out is I've got some cards that have got descriptors on them. Can we find these things? So just even looking and touching things and picking them up and seeing what things are like is one of those things that, so that group of 2 and 3 year olds I was talking about didn't realise that the leaves were not attached to the ground, that you could pick up the leaves. It took them a little while to realise that sticks and leaves were detachable. So if you don't know that about the natural environment, how are you going to play if you don't know what there is there? So starting to touch and feel and manipulate, and then some sort of little hook that might get you started. So one of the ones I've been using recently as a hook in earlier sessions is creating a birthday party for an ancient creature. So something like that. So if you want to make food out of mud, yeah, great, that's brilliant. If you want to make decorations, that's grand. If you want to invent a game, it also, you know, so it's open-ended enough that people can find their own way to navigate through it, but it's solid enough a starting point that it gets people going. And I think that finding those springboards for me is having a few of those up my sleeve can be really helpful to help children get into that natural environment, start building that relationship.
And it sounds like through the case studies you were just explaining there, that a lot of it is about saying yes and going with where the children want to take things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's something really key, isn't it, about permission, about children feeling like they've got permission, and also about setting up the boundaries as well. I mean, that's something, you know, if we're looking at forest school, the long-term process of forest school, having those boundaries is useful, but having the permissions is also really key. Yeah, if you don't know that you're allowed to touch a stick, how do you expect anybody to then play freely and fulfill all that potential?
Something I've noticed when working with groups, and it tends to be particularly as you go up the age groups, is sometimes they don't believe you when you say that they've got a choice. They kind of almost think that you've got some hidden agenda about what you want them to do and a particular outcome that you want them to create by the end of the session. So I wondered, do you have any tips if people are working with children or young people who aren't used to being within that framework where they have got choice?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I'm also thinking about some groups I've been working with recently where choice is a bit overwhelming, actually. So if you go, you can do anything at all, that is that same experience of overwhelm. I don't know if you've ever had it when you've walked into a supermarket and there's like 32 types of custard and you just stood there going, I just want custard. You know, it's that same experience for children if they're just told, you can do anything you want. It's too much. And especially for children who've got emotional or behavioural challenges, you know, challenges that they're experiencing, so that they aren't used to being in control as well. Practical things that can help those help children who aren't used to making choices is about having resources that offer certain choices. So I've brought the ropes today if anybody wants to use those. So it's almost like you're not defining what they're going to do with them, but giving them that solid starting point, and making sure that the resources that have been key to a child in a previous session, so again, part of that long-term process is about observing, reflecting, okay, that really worked for them previously, I'm going to make sure that's available in the next session, or something that might allow them the same sort of play behaviours as well, so that you're trying to consciously offer things that might give them a starting point as well.
We live in a world now where people aren't let to be bored, both children and adults, because, you know, as soon as they've got 2 minutes, they'll pick up their phone and they'll be scrolling through Facebook or anything. You know, it's very rare that people have a moment where they don't have anything to do.
Sometimes as practitioners, we also have to allow people to find their own way into things. So we can sometimes take it as judgment on ourselves if people aren't immersed in something. But actually being bored is a really, so some of the play theorists, particularly Sturrock and Else, they talk about the metalude, so the thing that you've got in your head before you start to play. And that if we don't give children space or time to like see what is there around them, what stimulus is there, what are other people doing, that sort of pre-play mental state, if we're in there straight away, here's 10 things you can do, we don't allow people to make their own decisions, we don't allow people to work things out for themselves. And actually, if children are building their own brains as they play, yet we step in and fulfill that need before it's even been expressed, we're not allowing children to build their own brains, we're just building ours. And who's doing the learning? And that's something that I keep, another of my reflective questions that I come back to for myself is, who's doing the learning in that moment? Whose kind of growth is being fed with whatever I'm suggesting? And if it's mine, then I need to back off, like, you know, get out of there.
Another thing I often hear sometimes from practitioners is they might be in schools or workplaces where there are certain expectations over their forest school sessions that perhaps are coming from managers who don't really fully understand the forest school ethos. So, for example, trying to get certain curriculum outcomes or to try and force certain topics to take place within forest school sessions. So I wondered, do you have any tips or advice for practitioners who might be working within that sort of situation?
Yeah, it can be really hard when the people around you don't share your values. And so if you're somebody who does value play and the children's experience, but you're trying to speak to people who the thing that's driving them is the standards or the results and things like that, that gap in values can be quite uncomfortable. One technique that I personally use quite a lot, if the person's alongside me when the children are there, is sportscasting or describing what I'm seeing. An example of that recently was a teacher that I was with, year 3 teacher, and we were watching a group of children, and they all had slightly pointed sticks. They were quite a long way away, and they were running and screaming with these slightly pointed sticks, and then they'd stop and they went, "Oh, I better go and step in because somebody's going to get hurt over there." And so I started to sportscast, I started to describe. So it's quite interesting because they're all running as a group to that tree there and then stopping, and then they look at something really closely and then they scream and then they run away again. So I wonder what's happening there. And have you noticed how this child, and so I really started to just describe everything that I was seeing. It does 2 jobs. It sort of calms and soothes me because it makes me feel like I'm doing something, rather than like, oh, everything's out of control. I should be in control of the fact that there are people running and screaming with pointed sticks. But also we started to really closely observe what was happening. And then he started to talk about the experience of those children. He said, yeah, it's interesting that it's this group of people, because they're all the ones in the classroom who don't have that self-control and self-regulation. And as we talked about this and kept describing what the children were doing, we realized that there was quite a lot of self-regulation going on. Like they were really in control of this quite high energy situation. So between us, we started to really pull apart what outcomes this particular group of children were getting from that experience, which would be very different to how the children were experiencing that moment. You know, we were kind of calmly analysing all of the outcomes while they were just having an amazing time and running and screaming and kind of, but really working through a lot of that social play that children need in order to be able to be social beings, social humans in the world. Something else that I find quite useful as well is reframing children's behaviour as play cues. So if somebody does something, that's a cue, that's an invitation for play. So if it's directed at me, they're inviting me to play. So if a child comes and throws a stick at me, I don't take that as them trying to be aggressive towards me. It's like they that's a cue that they want me to play in some way. They want to involve me in their play. And again, using that sort of language when I'm talking to others, talking to teachers, to senior leadership team about children's skill in play, because actually throwing a stick at somebody is a very unskillful play cue compared with, hey, do you want to play a game with a stick? I've got a stick here, verbally, is a much more skillful play cue. So actually then taking that example as not being about somebody's behaviour, but actually about their skill in playing. So can we give them more time, more space to do that? Because that's actually going to support their social development and their physical development and all of those whole range of holistic outcomes that you talked about earlier. So sort of helping people see the benefit of play can help people make space for it and make time for it as well.
Is once forest school's been running for a length of time, you can start to see different developmental changes and perhaps behavioural or attitudinal changes in the learners, and that usually speaks volumes to the powers that be in the school, because they're starting to see that the learner-centred approach is actually having positive effects for the individuals.
That's absolutely it, isn't it? That's why as a forest school practitioner we should be positioning ourselves as an advocate for children's play and an advocate for the children and their experiences. And so that might mean having those tricky conversations with peers, with colleagues, with senior managers And one of the things that I found really helpful is, well, so it's well known that policies are just power paper. There's a sort of paper you can just hold up and people, go away, I've got a policy. So it's all right, it's all okay, it's covered. So I always make sure that I've got a play policy in place, but also that people who I'm working alongside have seen that play policy, and that expectation around what the children will be allowed to do is really clear from the start of the programme, so that people are expecting the children will be allowed to have freedom and autonomy as well.
Earlier in our conversation, you did mention that perhaps we now have a generation of younger adults who are professionals working with children that might not have had play experiences themselves in childhood. And I wondered if there was a person who that was their background and they were coming to Forest School and trying to get to grips with play, having not had it themselves in their childhood. Any thoughts or tips around how to deal with that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I was writing some stuff on risk recently. So as part of that, I asked quite a lot of Forest School practitioners if they would allow a child to take a risk that they wouldn't or hadn't experienced for themselves. And that is one of those really provoking things, isn't it? Because actually how we build our experience and knowledge of things that are a bit risky is by doing them. You know, we have to kind of get in there and try them. So if a child's doing something that we've never experienced for ourselves, that can feel really uncomfortable. It can feel really challenging for us. And how do we deal with that is a really good question. So some people in this group of practitioners that I was talking to said that they paused the activity while they talked to the child about it, and that actually talking to the child helped them realise how competent and in control that child was, and that helped them build the confidence to go, actually they're fine. You know, we were talking about tree climbing in particular in this case. You know, so this child's climbing in a tree, and this practitioner who hadn't experienced tree climbing as a child or as an adult felt really out of their own comfort zone. But by talking with the child and watching the child, observing the child and reflecting on it, realised that child was fully in control, that, you know, the risk level was really low actually for them. So I think it is worth bearing in mind. One of the other things I talk to practitioners a lot is about play fighting. So particularly fighting with sticks. Don't know if you ever did it as a child. I did it a lot. Still do actually with my adult brother. If we're walking out somewhere, the two of us will get a stick and I'll start having a fight. And again, if you haven't experienced play in that way, it can seem quite aggressive, or it can seem quite dangerous. And certainly when I first started out working in natural environments, I remember like most of our staff meetings being around like what we were going to do about the stick energy, because everybody was always fighting with sticks. And you know, it was not the productive idea that we had in our minds for the stuff that we do. So we tried to stop it because we didn't know any better at the time, you know. That was one of my first roles in this sort of work. And what I realised is that I didn't have a chance of stopping that sort of play. But actually by being with the children, really observing them, talking to them about their play processes, they taught me a lot about stick fighting. I am so much better at stick fighting now than I used to be because of that interaction with the children, and also developing our language around it as well. So making sure that we've got consent with one another before we start stick fighting, and all those sort of things that just really help smooth the path of good, skillful interactions with one another.
So another misconception I've heard mentioned about Forest School is that you just rock up to the woods and you let the kids do whatever they want. They're just out there playing and the adults just sit there drinking tea. So what would you say to that?
Wouldn't it be lovely if life was as easy as that? And actually, sometimes in a long-term program, it can really feel like that as a practitioner. But the building blocks that you've put in place, the things that a trained practitioner, the skills that they will have developed and then passed along to the children, allow it to seem like that sometimes. But actually we're thinking about the scaffolding that we can offer for those children as well. So choosing our interventions so that sometimes we're taking on the role of the least adult, and that children can just play and follow their own ideas, but actually that we're ready to support and to scaffold and to extend that as well. So there might be times when the children invite us into their play or make requests of us as well. So one of the things that with the groups I work with is making sure we're discussing what they need and how we can resource that. So that's one of my roles, is sort of play resource person in that as well. But then also about introducing new skills and techniques in order to that children can extend their range of things that they can play with. So one of the things that Forest School is perhaps quite well known for in the UK is around introducing tools and fire to children, and those sort of more challenging risky elements. And you know, I wouldn't just rock up with a bag full of knives and go, yeah, just crack on, play with those 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds. So some of that does need support and structure in order that people can develop those new skills, so that then they can play once they've got those skills, they've got those building blocks in place. So sometimes as an adult, we need to put in those safety structures in order that we can enable a wider range of play experiences.
Sort of an analogy I sometimes use of the Forest School leader is one of a graceful swan that on the surface looks like they're, you know, serene and not much is happening, but underneath the water the legs are going because there's lots of quite subtle energies of the observation and the scaffolding all going on.
Yeah, sometimes the Forest School leader's like an upside down swan as well, isn't it? Like it's all just a bit flappy, and then but actually when you look around, everybody's really immersed and like gracefully swimming along, and the Forest School leader's just having a little flap because they've lost everything. Like, you know, it's both ways up, that swan.
Yeah, absolutely. I know one of the things I find the hardest as a practitioner to do with play and scaffolding is knowing when is an appropriate time to sort of step in and offer a little bit of structure or a particular skill that I think might move a learner on, and when actually to stay away and step back and let the learners discover it for themselves. Any thoughts or tips on that element?
Oh yeah, it's super hard actually, that because actually the process of sitting back and observing is really hard, especially if somebody's struggling with somebody. I'm thinking about a nearly 4-year-old who was probably stuck up a tree, but because of the place that I was working, I was quite determined not to intervene in that. And then, you know, like, it's sort of been quite a long time and I'm still got this nearly 4-year-old stuck up a tree. And they weren't distressed and they weren't upset and they weren't asking for help. So I carried on, and then suddenly I looked around and they were gone. You know, they'd sorted it out. But that was even somebody who's quite comfortable with risk levels myself. It went beyond my own comfort zone, right? You know, it was like, should I be helping? I don't know. So it's quite hard sometimes to watch somebody struggle with something. But actually, even though that nearly 4-year-old was maybe stuck in that tree, their behaviours weren't distressed or erratic. So one of the things I'm often looking for when I'm scanning loads of different people doing different things is the sort of energy that's being put out. So if you see somebody who's like a sprinter, they're moving really fast, but their movements are in a very flowing way. And they're not erratic and distressed. They're very kind of, you know, flowing. And in the same way that actually people who are really immersed in stuff will have that same level of control somehow over what's going on. Whereas somebody who's really struggling, so I'm just thinking about children using tools, like if they're not, you know, they're like got the knife and they're starting to hack like that, I'm straight there, because that's not a flowing movement anymore. They need some support, they need some intervention, because they're stuck, they're struggling. The same way that social interactions, you know, the ones that you start to move towards are the ones where it suddenly becomes a bit more, you know, choppy and kind of, I always think of it like a meerkat, you know, it starts to swivel like that, rather than something that's moving with a more flowing, graceful air to it. So yeah, that can help you when you're scanning a group, look for those children who might need a bit more support.
So I've heard another misconception out there about play just being for very young children. I wondered what you would say about play in adolescence.
That's a really interesting question, because, and actually even teenagers themselves wouldn't describe what they do as play. You know, that actually if you say, oh, would you like to go and play? That sort of language isn't going to work for them. However, they still want those challenges and stimulus that is playful. I'm just thinking about a group of older teenage lads that I was working with a couple of years ago, and if I'd have said let's play a game or let's play this, they would have just, the withering looks would have been strong. However, I used to just chuck out little challenges, things like, oh, I bet nobody could nick that bag while I'm cooking the pancakes here. And then we'd be in the depth of a really amazing game where we'd be playing and they'd be trying to sneak up on me and I'd be like, spotted you, get back to the boundary. And then they'd have their own games as well. Like there was this whole tracking a fox that turned into a gruffalo that they were tracking through the woods at one point, and they were really shrieking and so delighting in that playful energy. But if I'd have said to them, let's play a game of tracking an imaginary fox through the woods, you know, again, it's about how you introduce things to things in a way that is congruent for them, that fits with them, that doesn't feel patronizing or babyish, because that's the thing that they're trying to move away from. That's not, you know, developmentally that's not where they're at, but actually their need to play was super strong, you know, like really as strong as any early years child I've worked with. And actually that kind of, I can know, thinking about how this principle really fits with them all together is, for me, it as a forest school practitioner, about being learner-centred is about being an advocate for those children, for those individuals in that group, really observing what it is that they need, what it is that they're interested in, and advocating for whatever that is. And, you know, sometimes moving out of our comfort zones in order to advocate for the things that the children want and need.
I've often wondered whether the need for play gets stronger in times of stress, as I've observed, for example, year sixes in primary school, when the SATs are coming, suddenly they seem to really crave play in perhaps what might be considered more basic terms of play, very physical sensory play, as opposed to elaborate games and things. And I've noticed that in particularly when they seem to be stressed. I don't know if you've noticed anything like that.
Well, and I was just thinking about that, what we were talking about earlier about reframing children's behaviours as play cues, so that children who are really stressed will start to chuck stuff maybe, and we'll see that as them lashing out. But actually, is it an unmet play need that they're expressing? Again, like how skillfully that's expressed is a different question, isn't it? But yeah, we all have those play needs. We all, if you only need to watch a group of children on a bus or in a queue when they're not allowed to play, where they're meant to be just, you know, waiting in stasis, and they'll be finding ways to play. They'll be finding little games that they're doing, little kind of things that they're exploring, ideas that they're testing. There's I can't remember the name of the person, but they said that play is scientific experiments conducted by children. So all of those behaviours are like them testing the world. It's how children make sense of the world, and actually the things that they play with builds their experience. So if children play in natural environments, that becomes their experience of the world. If children only play on computers, that becomes their experience of the world. If children only play in concrete, that becomes their experience of the world. You know, so it's how children build their brains, their knowledge, their whole selves, their social selves as well.
As a final question, I wondered whether you had a first-hand example of the power of play and learner-centeredness at Forest School.
I was just thinking about that group of older lads that I was telling you about, and actually, one of them made a choice, and this isn't as much about play, but about his choices. He was experiencing quite a lot of stress at home. There was a lot. His family were homeless at the time and sort of moving between different relatives. And he chose in the Forest School session to make himself this little nest, this little bed. And he couched down in this little nest, in this little bed, and actually spent most of a session, this is one of the very early sessions that he came out to the woods with us in this little nest. And, you know, I kind of would go and sort of say, oh, just to let you know, this is what's happening over here at the moment. That's what's, and you okay here? And he was like, staying here. You know, and then at one point he said, oh, I'm not very well. And then he said he was fine, but he just wanted to stay in this nest. And afterwards we were reflecting on it, you know, like, oh, you know, was that stress coming out of that? What's going on for this child? And what was quite interesting was then hearing him the next week describe to his friend who hadn't been there that week everything that he'd seen from his nest during that day. You know, so actually his choice was something that was very static, very, you know, when we think about play, we often think about very active stuff, but his choice had been to just be in this one place and experience the woods from this one perspective. But he'd taken in so much and developed a real relationship with that little bit of the wood, you know, and he was saying, oh, and at one point a bird landed on that tree there, you know, so he'd really experienced a lot. And I think that is a good reminder that people don't have to be active or excited or having fun to be really deeply experiencing things and making those choices.
So we need to wrap up this conversation now. So a big thank you, Lily, for talking very honestly about your ideas for play. I feel inspired now to go out and find a stick and somebody to fight with. So you.
Do you know, I love that that's going to be the outcome of this this webinar, that everybody's just going to go, do you know, I am going to like take a stick and challenge my nearest and dearest. But yeah, no, thank you for the questions, because it's been really interesting to reflect on the power of learner-centred approach in Forest School. Mm-hmm. The reason why I was interested in talking about learner-centred aspect of Forest School is because my background's in play and play work. I used to be a play development worker for a number of housing associations and charities that worked with marginalised children and families. I also worked for the Wildlife Trust for a number of years developing their play programmes, and then managed a number of adventure playgrounds and self-built adventure playgrounds in Bradford. So coming from all of that to Forest School, I brought a lot of that experience and knowledge with me, and I've been a Forest School trainer for the last 10 years and chair of the Forest School Association for the last 2 years.
Thank you all for watching. We hope it's been a useful conversation for you and maybe unpicked certain things. We will put some references and signposting in the description bar below on the topics that we've been talking about. Do remember that this is just one of the 6 principles, so do look out for the other videos that are covering the other 5. And if you've enjoyed this conversation, do consider visiting our website at forestschoolassociation.org, and if you're not already a member, do feel like you can join us and support Forest School in the UK, and you'll also have access to lots of other resources as well. Big thank you, everybody. Bye.